So good to have you join us today. Hello, I'm Lee Jae-yoon in Seoul. Coming up on today's edition of Business Daily. Korea's consumer sentiment falls to a 7-year low in December, fueling concerns about a further drop in private consumption. As we wrap up the year 2016, we take a look at what kind of monetary policies central banks around the world have implemented to stimulate their economies. These stories and more coming right up. Consumer sentiment here in Korea has plunged to levels not seen since the country was slammed by the global financial crisis 7 years ago. Now, this comes as political turmoil takes a heavy toll on state affairs, and uncertainties from overseas cast a dark cloud over the country's growth outlook. Our Kim Min-ji starts us off.
Korea's consumer sentiment has slumped to an almost 8-year low. The Bank of Korea says its overall consumer sentiment index came in at 94.2 for December, down more than 1.5 points from a month earlier. The figure now stands at the same level recorded at the height of the global financial crisis in 2009. A reading below 100 means pessimists outnumber optimists. The December figure marks the second straight month it has remained below the benchmark after 4 months of optimism. A sub-index which gauges how the public interprets current economic conditions came to 55 for the month. That's down from 60 in November and marks a low not seen in 7 years and 9 months. Simply put, that means more people believe that economic conditions now are worse than they were 6 months ago. The feeble figures come on the back of mounting economic uncertainties. At home, the power abuse scandal continues to rattle state affairs, while the ongoing corporate restructuring drive and growing household debt are also factors weighing on the economy. In terms of external factors, the recent U.S. rate hike and incoming Trump administration have been flagged as possible stumbling blocks for the global economy down the road. In light of the growing anxiety, experts say it's important that the government get rid of excessive red tape that's hindering companies from fostering new industries, which in the long run will increase investment and boost incomes. Kim Min-ji, Business Daily.
Samsung Electronics remains the world's number 2 for industrial research and development for a third straight year. According to a survey by the European Commission's Economics of Industrial Research and Innovation, only 3 additional Korean firms, LG Electronics, Hyundai Motor, and SK Hynix, made it into the top 100 this year. The top 10 include Google's parent company Alphabet and Microsoft. Of the top 2,500 companies listed, 75 are Korean firms, 837 were based in the U.S., and 590 in the European Union. The organization says this year's survey is a reflection of the rise in corporate research and development driven by high-tech industries. LG Group says it will leave the Federation of Korean Industries at the end of this year, becoming the first major conglomerate to exit amid the influence peddling scandals surrounding the president and her confidant, Choi Soon-sil. The biggest contributor to the group, Samsung, is still a member, even though Samsung Electronics Vice Chairman Lee Jae-yong had told lawmakers at a parliamentary hearing earlier this month that the group would stop paying its dues and leave the FKI. The FKI is Korea's largest business lobby group with membership of the country's top 600 firms. It's currently facing allegations of coercing conglomerates into making major donations to 2 government-linked foundations allegedly controlled by Choi Soon-sil. Korean shipbuilders are looking at another gloomy year ahead, holding their order targets at levels similar to this year. Industry leader Hyundai Heavy Industries has reportedly set its target at $10 billion, greatly scaled down from its initial $19.5 billion. Daewoo Shipbuilding and Marine Engineering is also expected to retain its goal at current levels at about $6.2 billion. Samsung Heavy is said to be aiming slightly higher as the shipyard is set to clinch a major order from Italy early next year. Global research firm Clarkson Research Services says while orders are likely to fall to a third of usual levels next year, the industry will start to recover in 2018. By the end of this year, more foreigners would have visited Korea than any other year. And our Oh Jung-hee takes a closer look at what this means for the Korean economy.
According to the Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism, Korea is expected to see its highest ever number of foreign tourists this year, over 17 million. That's almost 2,000 visitors per hour and 32 per minute. The total number breaks the previous record of around 14 million tourists set in 2014. A great deal of the increase is owed to a surge in visitors from China. Their numbers rose by roughly 35% from last year to surpass 8 million for the first time. Japanese visitors increased by 25% to around 2.3 million. The number of tourists from Taiwan and Hong Kong saw a significant rise as well, by 60% and 24% respectively. Overall, the number of tourists rose by more than 30% from last year's figure, and part of that spike is because of a decline last year due to the spread of Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS. The inflow of foreign visitors is expected to have a positive influence on the Korean economy as well. The Tourism Ministry estimates the nation will earn over $16 billion in tourism income, see a production boost of roughly $28 billion, and create some 374,000 jobs. To further bring in more visitors and provide a better experience for them, the ministry aims to develop an original set of tourism contents for the nation by expanding joint efforts between the government and the tourism industry. Oh Jung-hee, Business Daily.
This year was quite a year for many central banks around the world as they put forth various monetary policies to try to boost their sluggish economies. Earlier this year, Japan surprised the world with its adoption of negative rates, following other European countries and the European Central Bank. But with the U.S. Federal Reserve having raised rates this month for the first time in a year, some are saying that the era of monetary easing may be coming to an end. So what can we expect in the new year as central banks around the world continue to look for ways to boost their economies? Let's find out.
Negative interest rates, in theory, should encourage banks to lend more and people to spend rather than save. They're also seen as a tool to weaken a country's currency and help exporters. Since the 2008 financial crisis, major countries have been trying to stimulate their economies and combat deflation by keeping rates near 0% or below. Back in January, Japan joined the European Central Bank, Denmark, and Switzerland by lowering its rate on deposits to minus 0.1%. So has this worked for the country? As of now, not as much as it had hoped for. Experts say Japan continues to battle deflationary conditions while real economic growth remains paltry. In contrast, the U.S. Federal Reserve decided to lift its key rate this month, potentially marking the start of a tightening cycle and the end of an ultra-low interest rate era across the world. As concerns continue to mount about the limited options left for central banks in staving off deflationary pressure, we look at what to expect from monetary policies around the world in 2017.
And to tell us more about this, Professor Yang Jun-suk from the Catholic University of Korea joins us in the studio today. Hello.
Hi there.
All right, so I think it's fair for us to say that this year was the year of negative rates, in a sense that there was a heated discussion over the effects of negative rates. Tell us more about this.
Okay, well, let's start off with Japan, because they're with this the longest. They started to lower their rates right after 1990 real estate bubble burst. And for a while, they tried very expansionary monetary and fiscal policies during the 1990s. That didn't work. So they continually lowered the rates, and that's been accelerated with the so-called Abenomics a couple of years ago. Now, the EU, right after the 2008 financial crisis, they also had to supply a lot of liquidity, a lot of money, but they didn't lower their rates as much as they could.
Okay.
But then the recovery didn't take place well either. Trouble with the EU is that because they have a lot of countries working together, they limit the amount of fiscal debt that you can have, so they could not really increase their fiscal expenditure by that much. So the EU became sort of the slowest performer of the global economy, and when they had a change of heart at the EU Central Bank, they lowered the rates, and that's why now they have probably the lowest rates of the three largest economies.
Then what were the effects like of negative rates for these countries?
Okay, well, it's probably not as large as they thought it would be.
Okay.
And part of the reason is that this was so-called the debt-induced balance sheet recession. Everybody had a lot of debt to begin with, private and public.
Right.
So even with lower interest rate, companies or consumers did not want to borrow to finance more investment or consumption. The lack of future hope for recovery, I think also made them very reluctant to borrow money even at the lowest rates. So the results are not as good as people hoped. But most econometric studies, most statistical studies do show that it probably did help.
Okay.
It's just not enough.
Now, there are also a lot of questions raised about monetary easing and growth policies driven by central banks around the world.
Right. As I mentioned, monetary policy, the central banks only has control over the interest rate and the money supply. And when you have a very serious recession, you need monetary policy and fiscal policy. They're sort of like the left and right hands. But I think for Japan, EU, and the United States, the fiscal policy arm was hobbled because these countries, these regions already had very high debt rates before they hit the recession. So they felt that they could not use the fiscal policy as much as perhaps they should have. So that teaches us, I think, that you should keep a good fiscal position during the good times. Problem is, a lot of politicians think that if you have a good time during the fiscal during the so-called good times, they should give the money back in taxes or increase spending. So you never really build up your funds that you can use in cases like this. So all the responsibility has been gone to the monetary policy, and I think that's why they had to drop their interest rates to these historical lows.
Now, but as we heard in the report, the U.S. Fed has raised rates in December this month for the first time this year. And some say that this is the start of the end of an era to unprecedented monetary easing. So what are your thoughts on this?
Okay, we'll have to see. The trigger for this is capital outflow into the United States. Slow outflow is okay, but if you have a very rapid outflow, then there's concerns about the currency crisis in the short run, and in the long term, structural unbalance in the global markets, where only the United States gets a lot of money for investment. Japan is somewhat lucky in that all of their government debt is in Japanese yen, so they can always pay their borrowers back, so they may stick with these zero rates for a long time. EU is the only viable alternative for international investors.
Okay.
So even there, they may decide to stick with the below zero rates for a while. But it's questionable whether it can continue if the U.S. keep continuing its rise in its interest rates. Also, I think all of these regions are looking at monetary policy, below zero rate policies, to see whether they're effective enough to continue.
Now, and of course, one of the biggest issues this year was the global currency war. I mean, in fact, U.S. President-elect Donald Trump has said that he will declare China as a currency manipulator once he takes office. So what can we expect between the United States and China in that respect?
Okay, well, almost all researchers agree that while you can have accusations of China being a currency manipulator maybe 3 years ago, it's not really fair to make it now, because the Chinese yuan has been appreciating for quite a while. Even the IMF said that this is probably an appropriate level for the Chinese yuan. Problem is, President-elect Trump and the Republican Party promised they'll do something about currency manipulation, pointing out China particularly. So they may just go ahead anyway, arguing that they did it before. But if they actually do that, then there's problems about there's questions about what the WTO agreements will have to say about that. Also, unlike China, Korea has most of the similar type of macroeconomic features, but Korean won is depreciating, partially because the United States interest rate has risen and there's a lot of capital outflow from Korea to US. If they cannot find China as a convenient target, they may try to find other countries, and Korea is very vulnerable on that point.
Now, continuing on that, Korea has been keeping interest rates at a record low of 1.25%. So what would be expectations for the Bank of Korea next year and its monetary policy for the new year?
Well, the Bank of Korea is stuck between a rock and a hard place. I think the government, the executive branch, Vice Prime Minister Yu wants the BOK to lower its rates, but there's the rising U.S. rates to be concerned about. There's capital outflow that's continuing. The Korean won has been depreciating somewhat quickly, though not dangerously quickly. And then there's perhaps the danger of more household debt increasing. So BOK doesn't want to lower the rates. It doesn't want to raise the rates either because Korean economy is not very healthy. So I think what they'll do is just try to keep at this rate as long as possible. And when they see the capital outflow flowing into somewhat dangerous levels, then they'll have to raise the rates then.
Well, definitely a lot of things will unfold in the new year and a lot of things to keep our eyes on. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you.
And that does it for today, but we'll be back tomorrow with more business news that matters to you. So don't forget to tune in then. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.